Max Jeffery has just returned from Estonia, where NATO forces are training close to the Russian border, simulating how an incursion by Putin's troops might be resisted. His cover story in the Spectator magazine is timely as predictions of a future conflict with Russia fill the airwaves, and as Ukrainian forces are forced to retreat after being overwhelmed by Russian attacks in the eastern town of Avdiivka. Max, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So tell us about the scale of these exercises that are going on in Estonia and who's involved.
These are exercises in Tapa, which is Estonia's biggest military base. So Estonia, it's right in the middle of Tapa, and it's about a 2-hour drive from the Russian border. And these are exercises involving Estonian troops, American, British and French. The one that I saw was between the Estonians and then against the rest. So the Estonians were defending 2 roads that run up north through a forest. And the Americans, the Brits, the French had Challenger 2 tanks. So these are some of the best tanks that the West has. It had a HIMARS artillery system, an F-16 jet, and the Estonians had Swedish tanks. They had their own bits and pieces as well. And this was simulating a Russian invasion of Estonia. It's minus 20 degrees, trench warfare, and a foot of snow. Obviously, they're not using live ammunition. They have lasers, so everyone has body sensors on them, and artillery systems. When they're used, a message goes back to base, and they calculate how many soldiers would have died. They then leave the battlefield.
Are you able to make any calculation of how well the exercise went? I mean, let's start with obvious things. Did you see things breaking down in the ice and snow, tanks and vehicles and so on?
They admitted that kit really doesn't work in these sort of temperatures, and not often cases. Engines don't start, guns sometimes don't work. Even very simple things. We were travelling around the exercise in an armoured vehicle, and things like trying to get the door open and shut when you've got frost holding it closed become really difficult. Equipment isn't made to be used at this temperature, and actually neither are the soldiers, frankly. A lot of the foreign forces, in particular, this was their first time operating in this sort of a temperature, and people find it really difficult, especially when you're in trenches. That's something that we've seen in Ukraine, and so that's something that they're trying to mimic. They're trying to mimic Russian tactics, trying to anticipate what a conflict with Russia would look like. So they're having to operate in trenches in minus 20 degrees. Equipment and people just often aren't ready for it.
I assume they're in white uniforms.
Yeah, white camouflage.
Do you think they were insulated? Were they kept warm physically?
Yeah, it looked like they had really good kit, to be honest. Like the boots they had that were going right up to their knees, warm helmets, hats, big military gloves. I was freezing cold, but they looked quite warm, to be honest with you.
Did you manage to talk to any soldiers?
Yeah, I spoke to a couple of British soldiers, the Estonian ones. The Brits said they'd kind of not seen anything like this in terms of the temperature. I asked them about their readiness for conflict. They actually seemed a bit more... they said they weren't, in all honesty, thinking that a war with Russia was all that likely. The Estonians said their favourite phrase was, "We were ready yesterday." They think that if Russia made an incursion across their border, that they'd be ready to fight them.
Don't you quote a comment by a soldier about fighting the migrant boats?
Yeah, he said, "We're already in war and it's against migration. We can't stop the dinghies." And then he sort of shrugged his shoulders as if insinuating we might not have that good a chance against the Russians.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me that while we're learning, I mean, certainly British troops will be learning from first principles about warfare in a cold climate. The Russians, on the other hand, must be learning a great deal because they've been 2 years in a war in which they did very badly at the beginning, but now seem to be doing rather better. Do you have a feeling about how much the Russians are learning?
I think a great deal. And you talk about the way that the troops are learning, but also the economy. Russia's economy is now on a war footing. They're producing a huge amount of artillery shells. And in contrast, Europe promised to deliver to Ukraine 1 million artillery shells by spring of this year. They're only going to send 600,000. Russian troops are used to operating in this kind of weather. They're used to fighting Western forces. They've also learned Western tactics. They've learned that they can jam HIMARS artillery systems. These were some of the best artillery systems that the West had. And in many cases now, the Russian forces have learned how to hack, how to jam them.
So Ukraine is very interesting because, I mean, it struck me, I suppose, after about 6 months, that in a way it couldn't be better for NATO because Russia was being humiliated in Ukraine. We were watching how ineffective the Russian military machine was. We were, wearing away that there was attrition of their resources, and we weren't having to do anything except supply artillery. Things now look a bit different because they are improving their tactics, and we now have this political situation where we may throw away all the advantage that we had by saying that we're simply not going to keep supplying them with ammunition. This is the position with the United States at the moment, let alone when Trump becomes president.
Yeah, it's really difficult, Michael, because on the one hand, Europe wants to continue arming Ukraine, but at the same time, Europe itself is actually running low on armaments. In Estonia, for instance, they don't have a proper air defence system. They were promised one last year at the Vilnius summit, the Vilnius NATO summit, the annual meeting of NATO countries, and they haven't got that yet because they're all in Ukraine. They think that there'll be something to fill that gap, but we're running low on artillery systems, we're running low on everything. In many instances, I just don't think they are ready.
The thing that most depresses me, and here there's the great historical precedent, is that politicians in the West don't want to talk about how bad things are and how much things would have to change if we were to put our economy onto a war footing, if we were to spend more on defence. And Stanley Baldwin, looking back on why we didn't rearm in the 1930s, said, if at the general election I had spoken with appalling frankness, that was his phrase. In other words, if he'd admitted how bad things were, if he'd started talking about rearmament, he wouldn't have been re-elected. One feels that at the moment that, we can see there's this desperate situation, but the politicians don't want to talk about it because we're having a general election.
And there's a divide as well, isn't there? Because the Baltic states talk about it very frankly. The Estonians say that they're really worried that this could happen soon. They say 3 to 5 years, the Prime Minister of Estonia says. Poland's head of national security says exactly the same. Denmark's defence minister, also the German defence minister. Here in the UK, though, we do hear very little of it. It's strange because you would think that actually building resilience among the civilian population would be a good thing. I think, though, we are starting to see that. You saw the head of the British Army talking about conscription, not saying that it was needed exactly, but trying to ready the population for the eventuality of conflict.
Something is starting, but I think not yet in the political class. Anyway, Max Jeffery has written a fascinating piece. It's the cover story in the Spectator. Thank you very much.